The lookout aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-1 spotted them just after 8:30 in the evening on January 29, 1943. Two small warships, their silhouettes barely visible against the rain squall that swept across Coquimbo Bay on Guadalcanal's northwestern shore. "Torpedo boats," he reported. The commander, Captain Aichi Sakamoto, had seconds to decide. His submarine sat on the surface, trimmed low with decks awash, preparing to launch a landing barge loaded with supplies for the starving Japanese garrison ashore. 6 months into the Guadalcanal campaign, this was what the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force had been reduced to, hauling rice and ammunition in the darkness, hoping to avoid detection. The vessels closing on I-1 were not torpedo boats. They were HMNZS Kiwi and Moa, bird-class corvettes of the Royal New Zealand Navy, small minesweepers converted for anti-submarine warfare, each displaced just over 900 tons fully loaded, measured 168 feet long, and carried crews of 35 men. They were slow, maximum speed of 13 knots, and lightly armed with a single 4-inch gun, light machine guns, and depth charges. 40 to 42 depth charges per vessel, to be precise. Against a surfaced submarine caught unaware, they were more than adequate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Charles Bridson, commanding Kiwi, had been patrolling these waters for 4 nights without contact. He and Lieutenant Commander Peter Phipps in Moa had received intelligence on January 26th that Japanese submarines would attempt supply runs to Coquimbo Bay. For 3 nights they found nothing. On the 4th night, in heavy rain that reduced visibility to almost nothing, Kiwi's listening gear detected a contact. Then, the ASDIC, what the Americans called sonar, confirmed it. Range, 3,000 yards. A submarine, on the surface, exactly where intelligence said it would be. What followed was 90 minutes of violence that would expose a fundamental truth about Japanese submarine operations in the Pacific War. The I-1 was a large, capable submarine, a Type J3 vessel, 357 feet long, displacing over 2,000 tons surfaced. She carried a crew of 94 men, mounted 6 torpedo tubes, and had proven herself in combat operations earlier in the war. On September 1st, 1942, this same submarine had torpedoed the carrier Saratoga, putting her out of action for 3 months during the crucial Guadalcanal battles. I-1 represented Japanese submarine doctrine at its finest: attack enemy warships, sink carriers and battleships, support fleet operations with reconnaissance and offensive strikes. But in January 1943, I-1 was not hunting warships, she was delivering food. The supplies. She carried rice, medical materials, ammunition weighed perhaps 20 to 30 tons, enough to feed the 17th Army on Guadalcanal for 1 day, if distributed perfectly. The reality was that most of these supplies never reached the frontline troops anyway. The jungle terrain made transportation from the beach to the fighting positions nearly impossible. Men carried supplies on their backs through swamps and over mountains, and many cargoes simply rotted on the shore before they could be moved inland. The Japanese Navy knew this. They continued the missions anyway because there was no alternative. Kiwi and Moa closed at their best speed. Bridson ordered his gun crews to stand ready. When the range closed to approximately 1,000 yards, both corvettes opened fire with their deck guns and machine guns. I-1's lookouts shouted warnings. Captain Sakamoto made the decision every submarine commander dreads caught on the surface, with enemy warships closing: dive or fight. The boat was configured for surface operations, her landing craft still secured on deck, her hatches open for ventilation, her crew distributed throughout the vessel for the supply transfer. Diving would take precious minutes. Fighting might give them those minutes. Sakamoto chose to fight. To understand why I-1 found herself delivering rice to Guadalcanal instead of hunting American carriers, one must understand the Japanese submarine doctrine that had been carefully developed over 2 decades, and the campaign that shattered it. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force in 1942 was among the finest in the world, at least on paper. Their fleet submarines, the I-boats, were large, long-ranged, and well-armed. The Type B submarines, like I-1, could travel 16,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, giving them the ability to operate across the entire Pacific. They carried aircraft for reconnaissance, could dive to 300 feet, and mounted powerful torpedo armaments. Japanese submariners were professionals, trained in pre-war programs that emphasized individual initiative and aggressive tactics. The doctrine governing these submarines came directly from Japanese naval theory, which itself was shaped by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's understanding of Japan's strategic position. Japan could not match American industrial capacity. Therefore, Japan must seek decisive battle, a single crushing engagement that would destroy enough American naval power to force a negotiated peace. Submarines would support this strategy by attacking enemy battle fleets, sinking carriers and battleships before the decisive engagement. They would conduct reconnaissance, providing intelligence on enemy fleet movements. They would serve as a strategic weapon, an extension of the combined fleet's power rather than an independent arm. This doctrine explicitly rejected the German U-boat model. German submarines waged war against commerce, sinking merchant vessels, to strangle Britain's sea lines of communication. This strategy required submarines to operate independently, to patrol vast expanses of ocean hunting vulnerable cargo ships, to accept that many patrols would yield no contact at all. The Japanese Navy considered commerce raiding beneath the dignity of their submarine arm. American cargo ships traveling between the United States and Australia were legitimate targets, certainly, but submarines should not waste time hunting them when they could be supporting fleet operations or attacking enemy warships. Pre-war exercises and early war successes seemed to validate this doctrine. On December 7, 1941, Japanese submarines participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, though not in the way most remember. While aircraft from carriers struck the battleships at their moorings, submarines, including 5 midget submarines, attempted to penetrate the harbor. The midget submarines failed, but fleet submarines patrolling outside, the harbor sank the cargo ship Cynthia Olsen and later torpedoed several vessels evacuating from Pearl Harbor. In January 1942, submarine Y-6 torpedoed the carrier Saratoga, putting her out of action at a critical moment when America's carrier strength was desperately needed. In June 1942, submarine I-168 delivered the final torpedoes that sank the carrier Yorktown, already damaged at the Battle of Midway. The most spectacular success came on September 15, 1942, when submarine I-19, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Takakazu Kinashi, fired a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes at the carrier Wasp south of Guadalcanal. What happened next was arguably the most effective single torpedo salvo in naval history. 3 torpedoes struck Wasp, causing catastrophic fires that would sink the carrier. But the other torpedoes continued running. One struck the battleship North Carolina, blowing a hole 32 feet long and 18 feet high below her waterline, flooding her with 1,400 tons of water and putting her out of action for 2 months. Another struck the destroyer O'Brien, causing damage that seemed minor initially but would prove fatal. O'Brien broke apart and sank 6 weeks later while attempting to reach Pearl Harbor for repairs. 3 major American warships hit by torpedoes from a single submarine in a single attack. These successes confirmed what Japanese naval planners believed: submarines were fleet weapons, tools for attacking enemy warships, capable of achieving results that justified their considerable cost and complexity. When Admiral Yamamoto reviewed reports of I-19's attack, he must have felt vindicated. Here was proof that Japanese submarine doctrine worked, that focusing on warship targets rather than merchant shipping was correct. The American supply lines between the U.S. and Australia remained largely unmolested by submarines. American cargo ships delivered troops and supplies with minimal interference. This was intentional, a strategic choice, not a failure. The submarines were doing exactly what Japanese doctrine demanded. Then came Guadalcanal, and everything changed. The campaign began on August 7, 1942, when American Marines landed on the island and quickly captured an airfield under construction. What was supposed to be a brief operation to seize a minor Japanese position became a 6-month battle of attrition that consumed resources from both sides at an unsustainable rate. The Japanese Navy found itself fighting not a decisive fleet engagement, but a grinding campaign of reinforcement and resupply. Warships became transports. Cruisers and destroyers formed into high-speed runs down the Slot, New Georgia Sound, to deliver troops and supplies to Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, then withdraw before dawn brought American aircraft from Henderson Field. This became known as the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, as the Japanese called it. Destroyers would steam south at high speed, arrive off Guadalcanal after nightfall, quickly transfer troops or supplies using landing craft or simply tossing supply drums overboard to float ashore, then race back north before daylight. It was effective initially, but American air power from Henderson Field made these runs increasingly costly. Destroyers were sunk, crews were exhausted from the constant stress of night operations in waters patrolled by American PT boats and warships. By November 1942, the Tokyo Express was faltering. The naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 12 through 15th saw the Japanese Navy lose 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 3 destroyers, while failing to destroy Henderson Field or deliver decisive reinforcements. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th demonstrated that even when Japanese destroyers achieved tactical victories, sinking 1 American cruiser and damaging 3 others with their superb long lance, torpedoes they still failed to complete their supply mission. The drums of supplies they dropped into the water were strafed and sunk by American aircraft the next day. Of 1,500 drums dropped, only 310 were recovered. The Japanese Army's 17th Army on Guadalcanal was starving. Approximately 25,000 men occupied positions across the island in late 1942. They required supplies that simply were not arriving. Frontline units went days without resupply. Rear area troops subsisted on 1/3 rations. Disease, malaria, dysentery, beriberi ravaged units faster than combat. Men ate grass, roots, anything they could find. The jungle provided almost nothing. Guadalcanal's interior was hostile terrain that offered no sustenance. Soldiers died not gloriously in combat but miserably from starvation and disease in fetid foxholes. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo faced an impossible situation. They could not evacuate Guadalcanal without admitting defeat. They could not reinforce it sufficiently to win, and they could not even adequately supply the forces already there. Destroyers were too valuable to risk repeatedly in supply runs that achieved minimal results. What remained were submarines. In December 1942, the decision was made. Submarines would conduct supply missions to Guadalcanal. This represented a complete inversion of Japanese submarine doctrine. Instead of hunting enemy warships across the Pacific, submarines would haul cargo. Instead of supporting fleet operations, they would support a failing ground campaign. Instead of maintaining strategic flexibility and offensive capability, they would become glorified transport vessels. The submarines assigned to these missions understood what this meant. Each submarine could carry 20 to 30 tons of supplies, loaded into their interior compartments or secured on deck in waterproof containers. This was 1 day's worth of supplies for the 17th Army, distributed perfectly, which it never was. The supplies had to be transferred to landing craft, brought to shore, then carried by hand through the jungle to wherever they were needed. Most never reached the front lines. The jungle swallowed them, crates left on beaches, drums that rolled into the surf, bags that rotted in the humidity before anyone could transport them inland. The missions required submarines to surface at night off Guadalcanal's coast, in waters patrolled by American and Allied warships, within range of PT boats operating from Tulagi. The submarines had to remain on the surface long enough to transfer supplies, making them vulnerable to detection. Their defensive advantages, the ability to dive, to disappear beneath the waves, to use speed and maneuverability underwater, were negated by the requirement to stay surfaced during the most dangerous part of the operation. They became targets, not hunters. Submarine commanders knew This was wrong. They had trained for years to attack warships, to use their vessels' capabilities for offensive operations. Now they were hauling rice, but orders were orders, and the Navy needed supplies delivered to Guadalcanal. There was no alternative. So submarines like I-1 began making the runs south, entering waters where Allied forces knew to expect them, because intelligence intercepts had revealed Japanese plans. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval codes. They knew submarines would attempt supply runs to specific locations on specific dates. They knew to position forces accordingly. The submarines faced more than just enemy warships. They faced a technological and tactical environment that had evolved specifically to kill submarines. Anti-submarine warfare in 1942 was not what it had been in 1941. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, had spent 3 years of war in the Atlantic learning how to hunt U-boats. Those lessons transferred to the Pacific. The technology of submarine detection had matured considerably since the previous war. ASDIC, developed by the British in the 1920s and 30s, had been refined through years of testing and combat use. The American equivalent, sonar, worked on the same principles, transmitting sound pulses into the water and listening for echoes that indicated solid objects. The QC series sonar installed on American destroyers by 1942 could detect submarines at ranges of 1,500 to 3,000 yards under good conditions. The effectiveness varied with water temperature, salinity, depth, and sea state. But an experienced operator could distinguish between a submarine, a whale, a school of fish, or a false return caused by thermal layers. Range estimation was possible by measuring the time delay between transmission and echo. Course estimation required tracking the target over time, but skilled operators developed intuition about submarine behaviour. The British ASDIC systems installed on Commonwealth vessels like the New Zealand corvettes, Kiwi and Moa functioned similarly, using different frequencies and slightly different equipment, but achieving comparable results. Detection was only the first step. Killing a submarine required coordinating that detection with weapons delivery. Depth charges remained the primary anti-submarine weapon in 1942. These were large cylindrical containers, typically 300 pounds total weight, with about 200 pounds of TNT or amatol explosive, set to detonate at a specific depth using a hydrostatic pistol. The pistol measured water pressure, which increased with depth, and detonated the charge when pressure indicated the preset depth had been reached. Settings ranged from 50 feet to 600 feet, allowing attackers to target submarines at various depths. The explosion of a depth charge underwater created a shock wave that travelled through the incompressible water with tremendous force. A submarine's pressure hull, designed to resist the gradual increase of pressure while diving, was vulnerable to the sudden shock wave from an explosion. The charge didn't need to hit the submarine directly. An explosion within 20 feet would likely rupture the hull. An explosion within 50 feet would cause serious damage: buckled plating, fractured pipes, jammed control surfaces, injured crew. Even near misses at 100 feet could cause damage that forced a submarine to surface or prevented it from diving again. Delivery methods varied. The simplest was rolling depth charges off stern racks as the attacking ship passed over the estimated location of the submarine. This had the disadvantage that the attacking ship lost sonar contact just before the attack, passing directly over the submarine and losing the ability to track it acoustically during the crucial final moments. K-guns, introduced in 1941 and standardized in 1942, addressed this partially. These were depth charge projectors mounted along a ship's sides, capable of throwing depth charges 60 to 175 yards to port or starboard. This allowed the attacking ship to drop patterns of depth charges, typically 7 charges in a pattern, with charges from stern racks and K-guns detonating in a diamond or rectangle around the estimated submarine position. The effectiveness of depth charge attacks was low, disturbingly so from the attacker's perspective. In the early months of the war, only about 3% of depth charge attacks resulted in confirmed submarine kills. By late 1942, This had improved to perhaps 5 to 10% with multiple attacks, but it remained fundamentally inefficient. Submarines could dive deep, change course after detection, rig for silent running, and often escape. German U-boats in the Atlantic regularly survived multiple depth charge attacks, though the psychological strain on the crew was immense. Japanese submarines, however, had different vulnerabilities. They were generally slower underwater than German U-boats, 8 knots submerged maximum for an I-boat compared to 8 to 9 knots for many U-boats, though this varied by class. More critically, early Japanese depth charges were set too shallow. The Japanese Navy apparently did not realize that American submarines could routinely dive to 300 feet or more. Japanese depth charges were often set for 150 to 200 feet, allowing American submarines to simply dive below that depth and escape. When the tables turned when Allied warships attacked Japanese submarines, the Japanese boats could not employ the same tactic. Allied depth charges were set deeper, and Allied attackers knew Japanese submarines' depth limitations. The corvettes Kiwi and Moa were not destroyers. They were smaller, slower, less heavily armed, but they carried depth charges, they had ASDIC, and they had crews trained in the essentials of anti-submarine warfare. When Kiwi detected I-1 on the surface in Kamimbo Bay, Bridson and his crew knew exactly what to do. Close at maximum speed, open fire to prevent the submarine from diving, get close enough to ram if necessary, and use depth charges if the submarine managed to submerge. It was aggressive tactics born from British experience in the Atlantic, applied by New Zealand sailors in the Pacific. For the men aboard I-1, this was the nightmare scenario detected on the surface. Enemy warships closing, no time to dive properly, forced to fight or run on the surface where their submarine was vulnerable to gunfire. The doctrine they had trained under never anticipated this. They were supposed to be attacking enemy fleet units, not running supply missions where they became targets. But doctrine meant nothing now. What mattered was survival, and survival meant fighting their way clear or sinking trying. The I-1 was a Type J3 submarine, officially designated as such in 1938 when she was completed at the Kure Naval Arsenal. She measured 356 feet 9 inches in length, with a beam of 30 feet 6 inches and a draft of 16 feet 9 inches. Surfaced, she displaced 2,231 tons. Submerged, this increased to 3,654 tons. Her pressure hull was constructed of high-tensile steel, welded and riveted according to specifications that allowed her to dive safely to a depth of 275 feet, with a theoretical crush depth somewhere beyond 350 feet, though no one wished to test that limit in practice. 2 diesel engines, Campon Model 22, each producing 4,700 horsepower, drove her on the surface at a maximum speed of 23.5 knots. Submerged, she relied on electric motors producing 1,200 horsepower total, giving her 8 knots, maximum speed underwater, though sustained operations at this speed drained her batteries rapidly. At more economical speeds, she could remain submerged for perhaps 48 hours before battery depletion forced her to surface and run the diesels to recharge. Her fuel capacity of 599 tons of diesel oil gave her an operational range of 16,000 nautical miles at 16 knots on the surface, or 96 nautical miles at 3 knots submerged. Her armament reflected her intended role as a fleet submarine designed to attack warships. 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow, 2 in the stern, could launch Type 95 torpedoes, oxygen-fueled weapons with a warhead containing 661 pounds of Type 97 explosive. These torpedoes ran at 49 knots to a range of 5,500 yards, or 36 knots to 9,840 yards. I-1 carried 17 torpedoes, total 12 as reloads, 5 in the tubes. On deck, she mounted a single 140mm gun forward of the conning tower and 2 25mm anti-aircraft guns. The deck gun was a powerful weapon, capable of engaging enemy merchant vessels or small warships, though using it required the submarine to remain surfaced and vulnerable. Inside, I-1's crew of 94 men lived in conditions that can only be described as austere. The interior of a submarine is not designed for comfort. Every cubic foot serves a function related to making the vessel float, dive, move, fight, or keeping the crew alive long enough to accomplish those tasks. Bunks called racks were stacked 3 high in the crew quarters, with barely 30 inches of clearance between them. Each man had a space roughly 2 feet wide and 6 feet long, curtained off from the passageway by a simple cloth. Officers had slightly more space, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet in compartments shared with 2 or 3 others, but even the captain's cabin was smaller than a closet inn. A typical house. The air inside a submerged submarine grew increasingly foul as hours passed. The crew breathed oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. Chemical scrubbers absorbed the CO2 using lithium hydroxide canisters, but the scrubbers had limited capacity. Humidity rose from cooking, from men sweating in the tropical heat, from condensation forming on the cool interior surfaces of the pressure hull. The smell was distinctive diesel oil, cooking odors, unwashed bodies, chemical scrubbers, ozone from electrical equipment, and the metallic tang of the steel hull itself. Men grew accustomed to it, but visitors from surface ships found it nearly unbearable. Temperature varied depending on depth and location. In tropical waters like those around Guadalcanal, surface temperatures could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the submarine when running on the surface with diesels operating. The engines generated tremendous heat, and ventilation was limited. When submerged, the lack of air circulation meant temperatures remained oppressive. Men worked stripped to the waist, drinking water constantly to avoid heat exhaustion. At night on the surface, tropical air temperatures of 75 to 80 degrees provided some relief, though humidity remained high. The crew aboard I-1 on January 29, 1943, had been at sea for days conducting this supply mission. They had departed from their base at Rabaul, travelled south through waters increasingly dominated by Allied forces, and approached Guadalcanal with the knowledge that American PT boats and Allied warships patrolled these areas. Intelligence had warned them. Previous supply submarines had been attacked. I-3 had been sunk by PT boats on December 9th. Everyone knew the risks. They came anyway because orders demanded it and because the army garrison on Guadalcanal needed supplies. Captain Aichi Sakamoto, commanding I-1, was an experienced submarine officer. He had served in submarines since the mid-1930s, working his way up through various positions before receiving command. His training had emphasized aggressive tactics, independent decision-making, and the importance of attacking enemy fleet units. Nothing in that training prepared him for supply runs to hostile shores under conditions where the enemy knew to expect him. When his lookout spotted Kiwi and Moa approaching through the rain squall, Sakamoto had perhaps 60 seconds to assess the situation and issue orders. The submarine was configured for surface operations. Her conning tower hatch stood open for ventilation. Her deck hatches were unsealed, with crew members positioned topside to handle the landing craft secured to her deck. This Daihatsu landing barge, 46 feet long and capable of carrying cargo or troops, was supposed to deliver I-1's supplies to the beach at Camimbo Bay. Getting it into the water required coordination, releasing the securing cables, using the submarine's cranes to lift and position it, then launching it over the side. The process took time, and time was what Sakamoto no longer had. Diving immediately was impossible, securing all topside hatches, clearing the deck of personnel, rigging the boat for dive operations. These steps required at least 2 to 3 minutes under ideal conditions, longer with the deck cluttered with cargo and the landing craft. The corvettes were closing at 13 knots. In 3 minutes, they would be alongside. Sakamoto ordered his deck gun crew to their weapon and directed the submarine to turn toward deeper water while remaining on the surface. If he could not dive, he would fight, using his deck gun to drive off these small warships while maneuvering to gain sea room. The 140mm gun mounted on I-1's forward deck was a formidable weapon, far more powerful than the 4-inch guns carried by Kiwi and Moa. Under different circumstances, surprise encounter at long range, with time to man the gun properly, and acquire targets, the submarine might have had the advantage. But these were not different circumstances. The gun crew scrambled from below, emerging from hatches into the rain and spray, trying to man their weapon while Kiwi and Moa opened fire from approximately 1,000 yards. The corvette's 4-inch guns and machine guns began hitting I-1 within seconds. Shells struck the conning tower, the deck, the superstructure. Machine gun fire raked the exposed deck gun crew. Men fell. Others took cover behind the gun shield or dove back through the hatches. The deck gun never fired. It could not be brought to bear fast enough, could not be aimed accurately enough in the darkness and rain, could not be manned under the storm of incoming fire. Within minutes, the weapon was effectively silenced, its crew dead, wounded, or driven below. Lieutenant Commander Bridson aboard Kiwi pressed his attack. He ordered his helmsman to steer directly for the submarine at full speed. 13 knots was not fast, but it was sufficient for ramming, and ramming a submarine often proved fatal. The impact could rupture the pressure hull, flood compartments, damage control surfaces, leave the boat unable to dive. Even if the submarine remained afloat, the damage might force her to remain on the surface, where she could be destroyed by gunfire. Bridson had already decided if he could not sink I-1 with depth charges, he would ram her. I-1 attempted to evade. Sakamoto ordered maximum speed and a turn to port, trying to present his stern to the attacking corvettes while opening range. On the surface, I-1 could make 23 knots to the corvette's 13. If he could get his engines up to full power and create some distance, he might escape into the darkness. But the submarine was not at full power. She had been loitering, preparing to launch her landing craft. Her diesels needed time to spool up to maximum revolutions, time she did not have. At 8:45 in the evening, Kiwi struck I-1's starboard side just aft of the conning tower. The impact was violent. Steel shrieked against steel. The corvette's bow crushed into the submarine's pressure hull, buckling plates, opening seams, rupturing fuel tanks. Men in both vessels were thrown off their feet. Damage control parties scrambled to assess flooding and casualties. Kiwi backed off, her bow damaged but her hull intact. I-1 listed to starboard, taking water through the rupture in her hull. Sakamoto now faced the decision every submarine commander fears. His boat was damaged, taking water, unable to dive. Enemy warships were still attacking. He could not outrun them with his boat compromised. He could not fight them effectively on the surface with his deck gun silenced. He could try to beach the submarine, deliberately running her aground in shallow water to save his crew and prevent the boat from sinking in deep water where she would be lost entirely. Kamimbo Bay offered shallow water near shore. If he could get the submarine onto the beach or a reef, the crew might survive. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Moa closed on the damaged submarine, dropping depth charges set for shallow detonation. The explosions erupted astern of I-1, sending geysers of water skyward and hammering the submarine's hull with shock waves. Inside the boat, the concussions were overwhelming. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Light bulbs shattered. Equipment tore loose from its mountings. The sound was beyond description, a physical force that seemed to compress the air itself, making ears bleed and vision blur. In the engine room, one of the diesel engines seized from shock damage. In the forward torpedo room, pipes fractured, spraying seawater under pressure into the compartment. Bridson brought Kiwi around for another ramming attack. At 9:15 in the evening, 45 minutes into the engagement, Kiwi struck I-1 again, this time hitting her port side forward. The impact crushed the submarine's bow plating, flooding the forward torpedo room completely. The weight of water in the bow began dragging the submarine down by the head. Sakamoto ordered all compartments aft of the control room sealed and directed the submarine to steer for the shallows. The boat was dying. Beaching her was now the only option. I-1 wallowed toward shore, her bow low in the water, her stern riding high, her diesels straining against the flooding that threatened to pull her under. The corvettes followed, continuing to fire. Bridson attempted a third ramming attack at 9:25, but I-1's stern swung away at the last moment, and Kiwi scraped down the submarine's side without making solid contact. At 9:35, I-1 struck a coral reef approximately 300 yards from shore. The impact drove her onto the reef at an angle, with her bow grounded and her stern still, afloat in deeper water. She listed 70 degrees to starboard, her deck nearly vertical, water pouring into every open hatch and damaged section of hull. Sakamoto ordered abandon ship. Crew members began evacuating through the conning tower hatch and any other opening they could reach. Men jumped into the warm water of Kamimbo Bay and struck out for shore. Some carried wounded shipmates, others swam alone, hoping to reach the beach before exhaustion or the current took them. Kiwi and Moa continued firing, though the submarine was clearly finished as a fighting vessel. Shells struck the exposed hull and conning tower. Machine gun fire swept the water around swimming sailors. Some men were hit and sank. Others reached shore and collapsed on the beach, then crawled inland seeking cover. By 10 o'clock in the evening, I-1 was silent. Her list had increased to nearly 80 degrees. Her bow rested firmly on the reef. Her stern had settled lower as flooding progressed through the aft compartments. No more crew members emerged. The corvettes ceased firing and withdrew to patrol the area, ensuring no other submarines approached and reporting their success to Allied naval headquarters. They had sunk a large Japanese submarine with ramming attacks, gunfire, and depth charges, using equipment and tactics that proved entirely adequate for the task, despite their vessels being small, slow, and lightly armed. Of I-1's crew of 94 men, approximately 30 died during the engagement or drowned attempting to reach shore. 64 survived and made it to Japanese-controlled territory around Kamimbo Bay. They remained there for 3 days while Japanese forces attempted to organize their evacuation. On February 1, 1943, 63 survivors were evacuated by destroyer during the first run of Operation K, the Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal. One man, too badly wounded to be moved, was left behind and later captured by American forces. Survivors who reached Rabaul were debriefed by Japanese naval intelligence officers. Their reports described the action in detail: the surprise encounter, the ineffective response, the ramming attacks, the flooding, the decision to beach the submarine. What emerged from these debriefings was a recognition that something fundamental had gone wrong. I-1 had been detected despite attempting to approach under cover of darkness and poor weather. The Allied forces had known where to position their patrol vessels. The corvettes, small warships not even designed primarily for anti-submarine warfare, had proven entirely capable of destroying a large fleet submarine caught on the surface. Most troubling was the realization that code materials remained aboard the wreck. I-1 carried codebooks, cipher materials, and signal documents that could compromise Japanese naval communications if recovered by the Allies. The submarine had grounded in relatively shallow water 50 feet at the bow, approximately 100 feet at the stern. American salvage divers could potentially reach the wreck and retrieve these materials. On February 2nd, a Japanese party reached the wreck in a landing craft and attached demolition charges, attempting to destroy it. The charges detonated but failed to sink the wreck further or prevent salvage. On February 10th, Japanese aircraft bombed the wreck. On February 11th and again on February 15th, submarine I-2 attempted to torpedo the wreck but was driven off by PT boats and aircraft. On February 12th, the American submarine salvage vessel Ortolan reached the wreck and commenced diving operations. Over the following days, Navy divers recovered waterlogged documents from the conning tower, including codebooks, charts, signal lists, and the ship's log. These materials provided American intelligence with insights into Japanese naval codes and communications procedures. On February 15th, the Imperial Japanese Navy officially declared all code materials aboard I-1 compromised, and began the laborious process of revising and upgrading its codes across the entire fleet. For the Japanese submarine force, I-1's loss represented more than just one vessel sunk. It represented the complete failure of the supply mission strategy. Submarines could not reliably deliver supplies to Guadalcanal. The risks were too high, the payoff too low. Each submarine lost was irreplaceable. Japan's shipyards could not produce submarines fast enough to make up for losses. Each experienced crew lost represented years of training that could not be quickly replicated, and the missions accomplished almost nothing. 20 to 30 tons of supplies per submarine, with most supplies never reaching their intended recipients, did not justify the losses. Yet the missions continued for several more weeks because there was no alternative. Japan could not abandon Guadalcanal without admitting defeat. The decision to evacuate would not come until late January, and the evacuation itself, Operation K, would not conclude until early February. Until then, submarines continued attempting supply runs. Some succeeded in delivering their cargoes, others were detected and attacked. The pattern established by I-1's destruction repeated submarines caught on the surface by Allied anti-submarine forces suffered catastrophic losses. The wreck of I-1 remained visible off Kamimbo Bay for years after the battle, a rusting monument to the failure of Japanese submarine doctrine in the grinding attrition of the Guadalcanal campaign. In 1968, the main deck gun was salvaged and brought to Auckland, New Zealand, where it was displayed at the Torpedo Bay Navy Museum as a memorial to HMNZS Kiwi and Moa's victory. In 1972, an Australian treasure hunter searching for valuable metals used explosives to blow up the bow section. The explosion, detonating live torpedoes still stored in the forward torpedo room, destroyed the front third of the submarine entirely, splitting the bow open and scattering wreckage across the reef. For the Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force, the loss of I-1 was symptomatic of a larger crisis. Between August 1942 and February 1943, Japan lost 6 submarines in the waters around Guadalcanal. I-3 was sunk by PT boats on December 9th, I-15 was sunk by aircraft on December 16th, I-1 was destroyed by Kiwi and Moa on January 29th. Each loss removed not just a vessel but an experienced crew. Submarine training took years. Producing experienced commanders required decades. Japan entered the war with approximately 63 fleet submarines. By war's end, Japan had lost 130 submarines, total some to combat, some to accidents, some to causes never determined. The ratio of losses to construction meant the submarine force steadily contracted rather than expanded. American anti-submarine warfare capabilities improved dramatically during the Guadalcanal campaign. The lessons learned in the Atlantic about sonar operations, depth charge tactics, coordinated attacks, and the importance of aggressive prosecution of contacts transferred to the Pacific. By early 1943, American destroyers and destroyer escorts carried improved sonar equipment, more depth charges, and crews trained specifically in anti-submarine operations. The introduction of forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog in late 1942 gave attackers the ability to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack, eliminating the blind time when ships passed over submarines to drop conventional depth charges. More fundamentally, American industry produced anti-submarine vessels at rates Japan could not match. The destroyer escort program, begun in 1941, delivered its first vessels in early 1943. These ships, smaller and cheaper than fleet destroyers, but specifically designed for convoy escort and anti-submarine warfare, would eventually number over 500 vessels. Each carried sonar, depth charges, and Hedgehog projectors. Each represented additional anti-submarine capability that Japanese submarines had to evade. The industrial disparity that characterized every aspect of the Pacific War applied equally to the submarine campaign. America could afford to build hundreds of escort vessels. Japan struggled to replace submarines lost faster than they could be built. Japanese submarine doctrine never successfully adapted to the realities of the Pacific War. The emphasis on attacking enemy warships persisted, even as it became clear that American convoy routes offered more vulnerable targets. In 1943 and 1944, American cargo ships transported millions of tons of supplies across the Pacific with minimal interference from Japanese submarines. Oil tankers brought fuel from the United States to forward bases. Troop transports delivered soldiers and Marines to invasion beaches. Supply ships maintained the logistical pipeline that kept American forces equipped and fed. Japanese submarines occasionally sank individual vessels, but they never threatened these supply lines the way German U-boats threatened British supply lines in the Atlantic. The contrast with American submarine operations against Japan was stark. American submarines adopted unrestricted submarine warfare from the war's first day, targeting Japanese merchant shipping without hesitation. Despite technical problems with torpedoes that plagued operations through 1943, American submarines steadily increased their toll on Japanese commerce. By 1944, with torpedo problems resolved and more submarines deploying to the Pacific, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them. By war's end, American submarines had sunk approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5 million tons, plus numerous warships, including 1 battleship and 8 carriers. They effectively severed Japan's sea lines of communication, strangling the island nation's access to resources from its conquered territories. The submarine campaign's outcome reflected deeper strategic failures in Japanese naval planning. Japan entered the war, assuming that decisive battle would determine the conflict's outcome. The submarine's role in this vision was supporting the fleet, attacking enemy warships, conducting reconnaissance, essentially serving as an extension of surface naval power. When the war became a grinding campaign of attrition rather than a series of decisive engagements, Japanese submarines found themselves without a clear mission that matched either their capabilities or Japan's strategic needs. The German Navy, fighting a similar war of attrition in the Atlantic, demonstrated what submarines could accomplish when properly employed. U-boats nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942 and 1943, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, until Allied countermeasures improved convoy tactics, more escort vessels, better anti-submarine weapons, and crucially, breaking German codes turned the tide. At their peak, U-boats sank over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. Even after the tide turned, U-boats remained a serious threat, requiring massive Allied resources to counter. Over 30,000 German submariners served during the war. Approximately 28,000 died. Their losses were catastrophic, but their contribution to Germany's war effort was substantial. Japanese submarines never achieved comparable results. The total tonnage of Allied merchant shipping sunk by Japanese submarines throughout the entire war was approximately 184 vessels, totaling approximately 907,000 tons. This was less than German U-boats sank in 2 good months. Japanese submarines focused on warships achieved some notable successes. 2 carriers sunk, numerous warships damaged. But these successes did not materially alter the war's trajectory. The carriers Lost Wasp and Yorktown were replaced by new construction within months. The battleships and cruisers damaged returned to service. Japan's submarine force expended tremendous resources and suffered heavy losses for results that, while locally significant, did not affect the strategic balance. The decision to use submarines for supply runs to Guadalcanal represented the nadir of this strategic confusion. Submarines are expensive, complex vessels requiring skilled crews and extensive support infrastructure. Using them to haul rice and ammunition to bypass garrisons represented a desperate misallocation of scarce resources. That the missions largely failed with supplies lost, submarines sunk, and crews killed made the waste even more tragic. The men aboard I-1 were professionals, trained for years to operate sophisticated equipment in the most demanding environment imaginable. They deserved better than to die delivering cargo that mostly never reached its destination. For the Allied forces opposing Japanese submarines, the Guadalcanal campaign provided valuable experience and confirmed that existing anti-submarine tactics and equipment were adequate for the threat they faced. Japanese submarines were competently designed and built, but they were not superior to Allied submarines, and Japanese submarine tactics did not present insurmountable challenges. American and Allied anti-submarine forces developed confidence that they could handle the Japanese submarine threat without diverting excessive resources from other priorities. This confidence proved justified. Japanese submarines never seriously threatened Allied operations in the Pacific after early 1943. The broader lesson of I-1's destruction was about the importance of doctrine and strategic vision. Equipment matters. Submarines must be well designed, properly maintained, equipped with effective weapons. Training matters. Crews must be skilled, disciplined, capable of operating under extreme stress. But doctrine matters most. Even excellent equipment operated by superbly trained crews achieves little if employed according to flawed strategic principles. Japanese submarines were good vessels. Japanese submariners were brave, skilled professionals. But Japanese submarine doctrine was fundamentally unsuited to the war Japan found itself fighting. The contrast with American operations was instructive. American submarines entered the war with serious technical problems. Their torpedoes often failed to detonate, ran too deep, or exploded prematurely. These problems persisted for 2 years before being fully resolved. Yet, American submarine doctrine was sound: attack Japanese merchant shipping, sever Japan's sea lines of communication, force Japan to divert resources to convoy protection. Once the torpedo problems were fixed, American submarines implemented this doctrine with devastating effectiveness. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was effectively destroyed, and the home islands faced starvation and industrial collapse due to lack of imported resources. Japanese submarines could have pursued a similar strategy against Allied shipping. The sea routes between the United States and Australia, between Australia and forward bases, between rear areas and combat zones all presented targets. Japanese submarines had the range to patrol these routes, the weapons to sink merchant vessels, and the potential to force the Allies to divert significant resources to convoy protection. But Japanese doctrine rejected this approach as beneath the dignity of the submarine force. The consequence was that Japanese submarines achieved far less than their potential, while American submarines achieved far more. The human cost of these strategic failures fell on men like those aboard I-1. Approximately 2,000 Japanese submariners died during the war. They died in actions against enemy warships, in futile supply missions, in accidents, in circumstances that were never determined when submarines simply failed to return from patrol. Each death represented years of training lost, experience that could never be replaced, and families who received only a brief notification that their son, husband, or father was not coming home. The bodies of I-1's crew who died in the ramming attacks or drowned attempting to reach shore were never recovered. They rest somewhere in the waters off Kamimbo Bay or in the jungle interior of Guadalcanal, where survivors died of wounds or disease before evacuation. For the survivors of I-1 who were evacuated to Rabaul and then transferred back to Japan, the war continued until its bitter end in August 1945. Some served aboard other submarines. Some were reassigned to shore duties as the submarine force contracted. Some survived to see Japan's surrender and the American occupation. They carried memories of that night in Kamimbo Bay, the shock of the ramming impacts, the sound of water flooding through ruptured compartments, the desperate swim to shore through darkness and gunfire, the days hiding on Guadalcanal, waiting for evacuation while American forces closed in. They knew they had been sent on a mission that made no tactical or strategic sense, that sacrificed a valuable submarine and its crew for minimal gain, that represented everything wrong with how Japan was fighting the war. The broader significance of I-1's loss and the 6 submarines Japan lost around Guadalcanal was that it demonstrated Japan's inability to adapt to the war's actual character. Japan had prepared for one kind of war, short, decisive, determined by great fleet engagements and superior fighting spirit. The war Japan got was different, long, grinding, determined by industrial capacity and logistical sustainability. Every aspect of Japanese military planning struggled to adjust. Submarines designed and employed to support fleet operations found themselves running supply missions, Destroyers built for fleet screening and torpedo attacks became cargo vessels. Cruisers meant for surface combat conducted shore bombardment. Carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor ended up attempting to deliver aircraft to Guadalcanal rather than conducting offensive operations. The United States, by contrast, demonstrated remarkable adaptability. American forces entered the Guadalcanal campaign with limited experience in amphibious operations, inadequate supplies, and considerable uncertainty about whether they could successfully contest Japanese control of the South Pacific. 6 months later, they had developed effective tactics for jungle warfare, established air superiority, built a logistics system that sustained forces across thousands of miles of ocean, and defeated every Japanese attempt to retake the island. American submarines fixed their torpedo problems and shifted to unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping. American shipyards ramped up production of destroyers, destroyer escorts, and cargo vessels. American factories produced the weapons, ammunition, food, and supplies needed to fight across the Pacific. The industrial disparity that doomed Japan's war effort manifested in every domain, including submarine warfare. Japan completed approximately 126 submarines during the war. The United States completed 203 submarines, plus hundreds of destroyer escorts and thousands of anti-submarine aircraft. Japan's shipyards struggled to replace losses. America's shipyards delivered new construction faster than losses occurred. By war's end, the United States Navy had more submarines in service than at the war's start, while Japan's submarine force had been reduced to a handful of operational boats, conducting desperate missions that accomplished nothing. When those first shells from HMNZS Kiwi struck Ioni Inch the Darkness off Kamimbo Bay, they represented more than just one submarine in trouble. They represented the collision between Japanese strategic planning and the reality of modern industrial warfare. Japan had built an excellent submarine force, according to pre-war doctrine, that emphasized fleet support and attacks on enemy warships. That doctrine was obsolete by December 1941, but institutional inertia and cultural factors prevented adaptation. The consequence was that Japanese submarines spent the war pursuing missions attacking heavily defended warships, running supply missions to bypassed garrisons, conducting special operations that did not materially affect the war's outcome. The men aboard I-1 that night in January 1943 understood this at some level. They were professionals who knew their vessel's capabilities and limitations. They knew submarines were not designed for supply missions in heavily patrolled waters where the enemy knew to expect them. They came anyway because orders demanded it, and because Japanese military culture placed duty and obedience above individual survival or even tactical logic. They paid for this with their lives, or with years of captivity, or with psychological scars that never healed. The wreckage of I-1, broken and scattered across a coral reef off an island that Japan no longer controls, stands as a memorial to a strategic failure that cost Japan the war in the Pacific. Not because one submarine's loss was decisive, it was not, but because that loss, multiplied across 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign and 44 months of the broader Pacific War, represented a pattern of misallocation of resources, misunderstanding of strategic requirements, and misapplication of doctrine that Japan never overcame. The submarine force that was supposed to tip the balance in Japan's favor instead consumed resources while accomplishing little. The men who served aboard these submarines deserved better leadership, better strategy, and a better fate than the one they received. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.